The deep space monitoring station on Europa hummed quietly in the darkness, its sensors sweeping across the void for any sign of intelligent life. Dr. Emily Watson had been staring at the same empty readouts for 3 years, watching for signals that never came. Tonight felt different, though. The coffee in her mug had gone cold hours ago, but she couldn't tear herself away from the console. "Still nothing out there, Doc?" asked Communications Officer Bradley, sliding into the chair beside her. His shift had ended 2 hours ago, but like Emily, he found it hard to leave when the universe felt so impossibly quiet. "Same as always," Emily replied, rubbing her tired eyes. "Sometimes I wonder if we're really alone out here, or if everyone else is just smart enough to stay hidden." The words had barely left her mouth when every alarm in the station began screaming at once. Red lights bathed the control room as the main display exploded with activity. A massive signal was cutting through space, stronger than anything they had ever detected. "What the hell is that?" Bradley shouted over the noise, his fingers flying across his keyboard as he tried to isolate the transmission. Emily's heart pounded as she watched the data stream across her screen. The signal was complex, layered with mathematical patterns that could only come from an advanced civilization. But something was wrong. The transmission carried an edge of desperation that made her skin crawl. "It's a distress call," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the alarms. The main screen flickered and suddenly filled with an image that took their breath away. A tall, graceful figure stood before them, her skin seeming to shift between silver and crystal. Her large eyes held depths of intelligence and terror that made Emily's chest tighten with sympathy. "My name is Ambassador Lyra of the Velthari Council." The being spoke, her voice carrying harmonics that human ears weren't designed to hear. "If any civilization receives this transmission, please know that we are dying." Emily grabbed Bradley's arm, her nails digging into his sleeve. They were witnessing first contact, but not the joyful meeting they had always imagined. This was a civilization's death scream. "The Devourers came from the dark between galaxies," Lyra continued, her image flickering as explosions lit the sky behind her. "We thought they were a natural disaster first, like a stellar plague that consumed everything in its path. We were wrong. They are ancient machines older than our oldest civilizations, and they exist for one purpose: to convert all organic matter into raw materials for their expansion." The transmission showed brief glimpses of the destruction. Entire worlds stripped bare in a matter of hours, their populations vanishing into massive processing ships that left nothing but empty husks of planets behind. 12 star systems had already fallen, each one home to billions of lives that were now nothing more than fuel for the machine swarm. "Our fleets are broken." Lyra's voice cracked with exhaustion. The Kethmoran battle cruisers lasted 6 hours. The Yelneshi Hive ships managed 8 before they were overwhelmed. We threw everything we had at them: fusion weapons, quantum disruptors, even stellar manipulation devices that could crack a moon in half. Nothing works. They adapt faster than we can innovate. Emily felt tears streaming down her face as she watched civilizations older than human history begging for help from species they didn't even know existed. The scope of the catastrophe was beyond anything she could have imagined. "The Devourers learn from every engagement," Lyra continued. "Each time we develop new tactics, they incorporate them into their own strategy within hours. They don't just defeat us, they become better versions of us, then use our own innovations to destroy the next system." Behind the ambassador, Emily could see other alien figures working frantically at control panels. Some looked humanoid. Others were so different that her brain struggled to process their forms. All of them moved with the desperate efficiency of people who knew they were fighting a losing battle. "We are transmitting the coordinates to our last sanctuary," Lyra said, her form beginning to fade as power failures racked her ship. "Any species capable of faster-than-light travel, any civilization that might have weapons we haven't tried, any mind that might see a solution we have missed, please respond. We have perhaps days before they find us." The transmission cut to static, leaving Emily and Bradley staring at an empty screen in stunned silence. The alarms had stopped, but the weight of what they had witnessed pressed down on them like a physical force. "We have to tell Captain Reed," Bradley finally managed to say. Emily nodded, her mind already racing ahead to the impossible choice humanity now faced. They had finally found proof that they weren't alone in the universe, but that discovery came with a terrible responsibility. Somewhere out there, entire civilizations were dying while waiting for a miracle that might never come. The question was whether humanity was ready to become that miracle, or if they were about to join the growing list of species that had tried to stand against the darkness and failed. The human ship Prometheus dropped out of hyperspace, like a predator entering calm waters. Captain Reed watched through the viewport as Sanctuary Station grew larger, a massive structure that looked like a work of art floating in the void. Delicate spires twisted together in impossible patterns, their surfaces gleaming with soft bioluminescent patterns that pulsed in gentle rhythms. "Beautiful," whispered Dr. Watson, pressing her face against the observation window. "It's like they built a cathedral in space." "Beautiful and defenseless," muttered Lieutenant Collins from his position at the weapons console. "Look at those hull readings. One good hit, and that thing would crack like an egg." Captain Reed had to agree. The station was gorgeous, but it had clearly been designed by beings who had never expected to fight for their lives. No armor plating, no weapon emplacements, no backup power cores hidden in protected sections. It was the kind of structure you built when war was something that happened to other people. "Incoming transmission, Captain," reported Communications Officer Bradley. "They're requesting permission to board." "Tell them we'll meet them in the main docking bay," Reed replied. "And Bradley, make sure our people keep their weapons visible but not threatening. I want them to understand what they're dealing with, but I don't want to start a panic." 20 minutes later, Reed found himself standing in the station's central chamber, surrounded by beings that looked like they had stepped out of a fairy tale. The Velthari moved with flowing grace, their crystalline skin catching the light and throwing rainbow patterns across the walls. The Keth Moran stood like living statues, their perfect symmetry suggesting minds that valued logic above all else. The Yolneshi clustered together in small groups, their symbiotic nature making them seem like one organism with many bodies. "Welcome, humans," said Council Leader Thane, his voice carrying harmonics that made Reed's teeth ache. "We are grateful beyond words that you answered our call." Reed nodded respectfully, but he could see the shock in the aliens' eyes as they took in the human delegation. Where the aliens wore flowing robes and ornate jewelry, the humans stood in practical military uniforms. Where alien skin seemed to glow with inner light, human faces were scarred and weathered from years spent in hostile environments. "We came as soon as we received your transmission," Reed said. "Dr. Watson has been analyzing the data you provided about these devourers. Emily, would you share what you've learned?" Dr. Watson stepped forward, tablet in hand, and Reed watched the aliens lean back slightly. Even their scientist was intimidating to these peaceful beings. Emily's hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her clothes were stained from long hours in the lab, and her eyes held a kind of focus that came from a species that had spent millennia fighting for survival. "The Devourer technology is incredibly advanced," Watson began, "but it follows predictable patterns. They use swarm tactics, overwhelming their targets with sheer numbers. Your fleets fail because you try to fight them like a traditional enemy." "Traditional?" asked Ambassador Lyra, her voice carrying confusion. "How else would one fight?" Reed saw Watson exchange glances with Lieutenant Collins, and he knew what they were thinking. How do you explain predator behavior to beings who had never been prey? "You fight to minimize casualties," Watson continued gently. "You retreat when your ships are damaged. You avoid sacrificing vessels unnecessarily. You try to preserve as many lives as possible. These are admirable tactics when fighting other civilized species." "But the Devourers aren't civilized," Collins interjected, his scarred face grim. "They're locusts. You don't negotiate with locusts. You don't try to minimize damage to them. You burn them out completely, even if it costs you everything." The silence that followed was deafening. Reed could see the alien representatives struggling to process the concept. To them, Collins might as well have suggested setting the galaxy on fire. "You speak of acceptable losses," said Thane slowly. "But how can any loss be acceptable when it involves the destruction of conscious beings?" "Because sometimes losing a few ships saves entire worlds," Reed replied. "Sometimes sacrifice is the only path to victory." Dr. Watson activated her tablet. showing holographic displays of human battle tactics. The aliens watched in growing horror as she demonstrated ramming attacks, kamikaze runs, and something she euphemistically called strategic vessel sacrifice. "Your crew's trained to fight in damaged ships?" whispered Veltheri pilot, her crystalline form flickering with distress. "Our crew's trained to fight in ships that are actively exploding around them," Watson confirmed. "We practice combat in zero atmosphere, with failing life support, while suffering serious injuries. Because in real war, optimal conditions are a luxury you can't count on." Reed watched the alien faces around the room and saw the exact moment when they understood what humanity was offering them. Not just alliance, not just additional ships and weapons, but transformation into something their species had never needed to become. They were offering to teach the galaxy how to embrace its inner monster, because sometimes monsters were the only things that could defeat other monsters. The question now was whether these peaceful civilizations could learn to think like predators before the Devourers found them again. The training began at dawn, if dawn had any meaning in the artificial environment of Sanctuary Station. Colonel Mitchell stood in the converted cargo bay, watching as the first group of alien volunteers shuffled nervously into what had once been a peaceful meditation chamber. The humans had stripped out the soft lighting and soothing music, replacing them with harsh emergency floods and the constant sound of alarms. "This is wrong," whispered Pilot Nira, a Veltheri whose crystal skin normally shimmered with calm blues and greens. Now it flickered with agitated reds and yellows as she stared at the obstacle course the humans had constructed. "We were not meant to function in such chaos." Lieutenant David Park overheard her comment and walked over, his movements casual despite the fact that he was wearing a full combat suit with a cracked helmet visor. "That's exactly the problem," he said, his voice carrying the patience of someone who had explained this 100 times before. "Your people were designed for a peaceful galaxy, but peace is a luxury that evolution didn't give to Earth." Park gestured the course ahead of them, a nightmarish collection of spinning blades, electrical hazards, and sections that would randomly flood with smoke or depressurize without warning. "On my homeworld, babies learn to swim in oceans that can kill them. Children play games that would terrify adult warriors from other species. We don't do this because we're cruel. We do it because our planet never gave us a choice." The alien trainees looked at each other with growing unease. They had volunteered for this program because their own military leaders had failed catastrophically against the Devourers. But understanding the necessity didn't make the reality any easier to accept. "The first lesson is simple," Colonel Mitchell announced, her voice cutting through their whispered conversations. "Your ship is burning. The life support is failing. Half your crew is dead. The enemy is still shooting at you. What do?" A Keth Moran officer raised his hand tentatively. "We would attempt emergency repairs while conducting an orderly evacuation to—" "You die," Mitchell interrupted. "While you're organizing your orderly evacuation, the Devourers are already boarding your ship and converting your crew into raw materials." She walked over to a control panel and pressed a series of buttons. Immediately, the training bay filled with thick smoke and the temperature dropped 20 degrees. Emergency lights began flashing in random patterns while a recording of screaming voices echoed from hidden speakers. "This is what real combat feels like," Mitchell shouted over the chaos. "Your instruments are useless. You can't see 3 feet in front of you, and everything you train for in perfect conditions means nothing. Now run the course." What followed was a disaster. The Veltheri pilot collapsed within minutes, overwhelmed by the sensory chaos. A group of Yolneshi symbiotes became separated and spent 10 minutes searching for each other instead of completing the objectives. The Keth Moran officer stood frozen in the starting position, his logical mind unable to process the random variables. Park watched the carnage with grim satisfaction. This was exactly what he had expected, and exactly what needed to happen. "Turn it off," he called to Mitchell. The lights returned to normal and the smoke cleared, revealing a collection of alien trainees who looked like they had just survived a natural disaster. Some were crying. Others were trying to help teammates who had been injured by the relatively mild obstacles. "I know this seems cruel," Park said, his voice gentler now, "but I want you to understand something. What you just experienced, that was training level 1. The easiest setting we could create. In real combat, you don't get breaks. The smoke doesn't clear. The alarms don't stop. Your friends don't get to rest when they're hurt. He walked over to Pilot Nira, who was sitting on the floor with her head in her hands. On my first day in the academy, they threw me into a swimming pool while wearing full combat gear. I nearly drowned. But you know what I learned? I learned that panic kills you faster than bullets do. Engineer Helen Davies emerged from behind a bank of computers, her hands stained with grease and her uniform torn from crawling through maintenance shafts. She had been working for 18 hours straight, retrofitting alien ships with what humans euphemistically called survival modifications. "The ships are ready for the next phase," she announced. "I've installed manual overrides on every system, backup power supplies that can function even when the main cores are destroyed, and emergency controls that will work even if the bridge is completely gone." Council Leader Thane studied the modification plans with visible distress. "These changes will make our vessels crude, inefficient. They violate every principle of elegant design." Davies laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Elegant design is for species that never had to worry about their ships being torn apart while they were still inside them. Every modification I've made comes from hard experience. Human ships aren't beautiful, but they keep flying even when they should be dead. The training continued for weeks, and slowly, impossibly, the alien crews began to adapt. They learned to function while injured, to make split-second decisions with incomplete information, to continue fighting even when their rational minds told them the situation was hopeless. But the real breakthrough came during a simulated combat exercise when Pilot Nira did something that shocked everyone, including herself. When her training ship's engines failed and enemy drones closed in for kill, she didn't retreat or call for help. Instead, she aimed her disabled vessel directly at the largest drone and triggered the self-destruct sequence. In the stunned silence that followed, Park's voice carried a mixture of pride and sorrow. "Now you're beginning to understand. Sometimes the only way to win is to be willing to lose everything." The first joint operation was supposed to be a simple reconnaissance mission. Captain Reed had chosen what the humans considered an easy target, a single Devourer scout ship that had been separated from the main swarm. The plan was straightforward: jump in, gather intelligence, and jump out before reinforcements arrived. "Remember what we taught you," Lieutenant Collins said over the comm channel as the mixed fleet dropped out of hyperspace. "Stay mobile, don't get locked into formation patterns, and if something goes wrong, adapt quickly." The Devourer ship hung in space like a metallic cancer, its surface crawling with repaired drones that constantly rebuilt and modified its hull. Even from a distance, Reed could see why the alien fleets had failed so miserably. The thing didn't look like a warship. It looked like a living organism that happened to be made of metal and circuits. "Beginning scan now," reported Dr. Watson from her position on the bridge, getting good readings on their defensive systems. "This intel will be invaluable for her." Her words were cut off as a Devourer ship suddenly split apart like a blooming flower, revealing not one vessel but dozens of smaller craft that had been hidden inside its hull. The trap had been set perfectly, and the joint fleet was flying straight into it. "All ships, evasive maneuvers," Reed shouted, but he could already see the problem. The alien vessels were trying to execute the graceful, coordinated movements they had trained for their entire careers. They moved like dancers performing a ballet, beautiful and precise, and completely wrong for the situation. The Devourer ships moved like a school of predatory fish, their formations shifting and adapting in real time as they analyzed the defensive patterns. Within minutes, they had identified the weakest points in the alien fleet and were converging on them with mechanical precision. Reed watched in growing horror as a Velthari cruiser took a direct hit to its engine compartment. Instead of continuing to fight with reduced power, the crew immediately began evacuation procedures, just as they had been trained for generations. The ship was still perfectly functional for combat, but their instincts told them to preserve life above all else. "Phoenix to Crystal Wing," Reed called desperately. "You can still fight. Your weapons are operational." "Negative, Phoenix," came the reply from Captain Velnara. "We have casualties and system failures. We must withdraw to ensure crew survival. If you withdraw, they'll pick you apart." Collins shouted, "Stay in formation and keep fighting." But it was too late. The moment the Veltheri ship broke formation, the Devourers swarmed it like antibodies attacking an infection. The elegant vessel lasted less than 30 seconds before its hull cracked open like an egg, spilling atmosphere and debris into the void. The sight of their allies' destruction sent shock waves through the remaining alien ships. Reed could hear panic in her comm channels as crews that had never seen real combat tried to process what they had just witnessed. Some ships froze in place, their crews paralyzed by indecision. Others began random evasive maneuvers that broke what remained of their formation. "This is exactly what we warned you about." Park's voice cut through the chaos as his fighter squadron engaged the Devourer scouts. "They're not following your rules. Stop trying to fight them like civilized opponents." Reed made a decision that would haunt him for years afterward. The mission was compromised. The alien crews were falling apart, and the only way to save any of them was to do what humans did best: sacrifice the few for the many. "All human vessels, execute ramming protocol," he ordered, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was asking. "Target the command ship. Full power to engines." "Sir," his helmsman said quietly, "that's a suicide run." "I know," Reed replied. "Do it anyway?" What happened next became legend among both human and alien crews. 3 human vessels, the Prometheus, the Defiant, and the Retribution, formed up in a tight formation and accelerated directly toward the largest Devourer's ship. They ignored the weapons fire that tore through their hulls, ignored the system failures that would have sent alien crews into retreat, ignored everything except their target. The alien crews watched in stunned silence as the human ships continued their attack even as they came apart around their crews. The Defiant lost its entire port side, but kept flying. The Retribution S-Bridge was destroyed, but the crew kept fighting from engineering. The Prometheus was on fire from bow to stern, but Reed never wavered from his course. The collision was spectacular. The combined mass of the 3 human ships punched through Devourer's adapted defenses like a spear through silk, creating a chain reaction that consumed the entire enemy vessel. The explosion lit up the dark like a newborn star, and when the light faded, both the Devourers and their human attackers were gone. In the aftermath, as rescue ships searched for survivors, Pilot Nira found herself staring at a piece of debris that had once been part of Captain Reed's bridge. The metal was twisted and blackened, but she could still make out part of a nameplate that read Earth. For the first time in her life, she understood what the humans had been trying to teach them. Sometimes winning meant being willing to lose everything, and sometimes the only way to save lives was to spend them without hesitation. The real war was just beginning, and the galaxy's civilized species were about to learn what it meant to fight like humans. The final assault on the Devourer Prime Nexus had been planned for 3 months, but everyone knew the real planning had taken place over the previous year of desperate fighting. Every battle, every sacrifice, every lesson learned in blood had led to this moment. The combined fleet hung at the edge of the Terminus system, staring at what had once been 3 thriving worlds and was now a mechanical nightmare. Admiral Stone stood on the bridge of the Vengeance, watching the tactical display with grim satisfaction. The fleet around him bore little resemblance to the elegant vessels that had first answered humanity's call for alliance. Veltheri ships now bristled with crude but effective armor plating. Keth Moran cruisers had been stripped of their ceremonial decorations and fitted with redundant weapon systems. Even the peaceful Yol-Neshi had learned to mount suicide drones on their graceful carriers. "Final count, Admiral," reported Communications Officer Bradley, his voice carrying the weight of impossible numbers. 1,417 ships from 23 different species. Best estimate is that 60% won't be coming home. Stone nodded without emotion. A year ago, those numbers would have horrified every alien commander in the fleet. Now they accepted the projected casualties with the same cold calculation that had once been humanity's burden alone. "Admiral," came a voice from the comm system. "This is Council Leader Thane aboard the Harmony. All ships report ready for final engagement." Stone almost smiled at that. The Harmony had been the most beautiful ship in the Keth Moran fleet when this war began. A work of art that could cross the galaxy while its crew composed poetry in the observation lounges. Now it looked like a flying weapons platform, its hull scarred from a dozen battles, and its elegant lines broken by the practical additions that kept it fighting when by all rights it should have been dead. "Dr. Watson, give me one more confirmation on the stellar charges," Stone ordered. Watson's voice came back immediately, steady and professional despite the magnitude of what they were about to attempt. "All charges are in position around the 3 target stars. When we trigger the cascade, we'll have approximately 18 minutes before the systems go supernova. The gravitational disruption should be enough to tear the Nexus apart even if our conventional weapons fail. 18 minutes to destroy a machine intelligence that had consumed half a galaxy. 18 minutes to save what remained a galactic civilization. And if they failed, those same stellar charges would ensure that the Devourers couldn't use the resources of this system to rebuild. All ships. This is Admiral Stone," he announced, his voice carrying across the fleet. "You know the plan. The Nexus is defended by everything the Devourers have left. We're going to punch through their perimeter, deliver the charges to the core structure, and detonate the stars behind us. Some of you won't make it home, but your children will grow up in a galaxy where they don't have to look over their shoulders at the dark between stars." The response that came back would have been impossible a year ago. Hundreds of alien voices, speaking in dozens of languages, all giving the same reply that human crews had used for centuries when facing impossible odds. "Understood, sir. We are ready." The battle that followed was everything the war had been building toward. The Devourer defenses were vast and terrible, automated weapons platforms that could strip a moon bare in minutes. But the Allied fleet no longer fought like the civilized species they had once been. They fought like cornered animals, like survivors of a world that had never given the luxury of mercy. Pilot Nera led her squadron in a suicide run that carved a hole through the enemy's outer perimeter, her ship disintegrating around her as she screamed human battle cries in her crystalline voice. Commander Velketh sacrificed his entire battle group to take out a single Devourer processing station, ramming his flagship into the target, while his crew sang ancient songs of honor and death. Stone watched the carnage unfold and felt something break inside him. These weren't human tactics anymore. They were something new, something that the galaxy had been forced to become in order to survive. The aliens were no longer fighting like humans. They were fighting like themselves, but with all the innocence burned out of them. "Charges delivered," Watson reported, her voice tight with strain. "Stellar cascade initiating. All ships. You have 15 minutes to clear the blast radius." The retreat was as brutal as the attack. Ships that could have been saved were abandoned when their engines failed. Crews that could have been rescued were left behind when time ran short. The galaxy species had learned humanity's cruelest lesson. Sometimes survival meant leaving people behind. When the stars exploded, they took the Devourer Nexus with them, along with 347 Allied vessels that hadn't made it to minimum safe distance. The light of their sacrifice was visible from 100 systems, a brief new consolation that marked the end of the machine threat. In the aftermath, as survivors counted their losses and tried to rebuild, Ambassador Lyra transmitted a final message to the human fleet. Her crystalline form was cracked and scarred, her voice carrying harmonics of grief and something darker. "The galaxy is saved," she said simply, "but we are no longer the species that first called for your help. We have become something else, something harder. Our children will grow up knowing how to kill, how to sacrifice, how to choose between terrible options. You taught us to survive, but survival came with a price we didn't understand when we asked for your help." The human ships were already fading into hyperspace, returning to whatever corner of the galaxy they called home. They left behind a civilization that was safe, but forever changed. Species that had traded their innocence for the knowledge that sometimes being civilized was a luxury that the universe simply wouldn't allow. The war was over. The question that remained was whether what they had become was still worth saving.